Welcome to the Global Challenge. 213, 216, 4 years of right use of time, right use of mind, and the right use of time and mind is to make these affirmations, which are simply to remind ourselves of truth. That is the very best use of time and mind, to simply remind ourselves that truth is true. And we do this through these affirmations. I'm Clarity Ross. Welcome to the video, and I am here to help facilitate this effort, this global challenge to use right use of time and mind by leading the affirmations, encouraging like a trainer, saying, come on, you can do it, let's do it. So we're going to do in this video, we are going to look at a closer look at the internal states of mind that we struggle with, and to remind ourselves that none of these can teach the ego anything, which is very important, because everything that we think we're experiencing is really an attempt to teach the ego something. Everything here is an attempt to teach the ego something. We're trying to teach the ego something through this state, this state, this state, this perception, that perception, this situation, that situation. We're attempting to teach the ego something. But there is no learner, and therefore there is no teaching, and there's nothing to learn, actually. So we need to come out of that. We can't really use learning or teaching so much. We have to use affirmation, which is reminding ourselves of that truth is true. That's all. That's all we need to remind ourselves. It hasn't changed at all. So we are going to work now on some internal states. I'll mention a few, and we'll get a sense of how to climb the ladder. We can start off like loneliness. Loneliness can't teach the ego anything. Loneliness doesn't need to be loneliness. Instead of loneliness, oneness is seen. Sadness. Sadness can't teach the ego anything. Sadness doesn't need to be sadness. Instead of sadness, oneness is seen. Isolation. Isolation can't teach the ego anything. Isolation doesn't need to be isolation. Instead of isolation, oneness is seen. Estrangement. Estrangement can't teach the ego anything. Estrangement doesn't need to be estrangement. Instead of estrangement, oneness is seen. Instability can't teach the ego anything. Instability doesn't need to be instability. Instead of instability, oneness is seen. Disassociation. Disassociation can't teach the ego anything. Disassociation doesn't need to be disassociation. Instead of disassociation, oneness is seen. Paranoia can't teach the ego anything. Paranoia doesn't need to be paranoia. Instead of paranoia, oneness is seen. Confusion. Confusion can't teach the ego anything. Confusion doesn't need to be confusion. Instead of confusion, oneness is seen. Anxiety can't teach the ego anything. Anxiety doesn't need to be anxiety. Instead of anxiety, oneness is seen. Duality can't teach the ego anything. Duality doesn't need to be duality. Instead of duality, oneness is seen. Depression can't teach the ego anything. Depression doesn't need to be depression. Instead of depression, oneness is seen. Hurt feelings can't teach the ego anything. Hurt feelings don't need to be hurt feelings. Instead of hurt feelings, oneness is seen. Feeling minimized can't teach the ego anything. Feeling minimized doesn't need to be feeling minimized. Instead of feeling minimized, oneness is seen. Grandiosity can't teach the ego anything. Grandiosity doesn't need to be grandiosity. Instead of grandiosity, oneness can be seen. Oneness is seen. Sorry, I'm supposed to use the right form. Oneness is seen. Psychosis can't teach the ego anything. Psychosis doesn't need to be psychosis. Instead of psychosis, oneness is seen. Schizophrenia can't teach the ego anything. Schizophrenia doesn't need to be schizophrenia. Instead of schizophrenia, oneness is seen. Neurosis can't teach the ego anything. Neurosis doesn't need to be neurosis. Instead of neurosis, oneness is seen. Derangement can't teach the ego anything. Derangement doesn't need to be derangement. Instead of derangement, oneness is seen. Split mind can't teach the ego anything. Split mind doesn't need to be split mind. Instead of split mind, oneness is seen. And mental chaos can't teach the ego anything. Mental chaos doesn't need to be mental chaos. Instead of mental chaos, oneness is seen. Okay, so we've just taken kind of an excursion through the realm of mental suffering, of the mind, that we don't have to be all-encompassing. We're not trying to list every single malady of the mind because there's all sorts of stuff. But what we're doing is we're reminding ourselves of the basics, that all this different mental confusion and upset, etc., can't teach the ego anything. No matter what we do with our mind, this cannot teach the ego anything. So we're just using the negative aspects of using the mind to try and teach the ego something through all these ghastly, terrible sufferings the mind puts itself through in an attempt to teach the ego something. All futile, all futile. So we're going to practice. You're going to chime in here. Just run through some stuff and don't have to be include everything, just representative. Okay, so we'll start off with sadness. Sadness can't teach the ego anything. Sadness doesn't need to be sadness. Instead of sadness, oneness is seen. Loneliness can't teach the ego anything. Loneliness doesn't need to be loneliness. Instead of loneliness, oneness is seen. Isolation can't teach the ego anything. Isolation doesn't need to be isolation. Instead of isolation, oneness is seen. Despair can't teach the ego anything. Despair doesn't need to be despair. Instead of despair, oneness is seen. Depression can't teach the ego anything. Depression doesn't need to be depression. Instead of depression, oneness is seen. Psychosis can't teach the ego anything. Psychosis doesn't need to be psychosis. Instead of psychosis, oneness is seen. Neurosis can't teach the ego anything. Neurosis doesn't need to be neurosis. Instead of neurosis, oneness is seen. Split mind can't teach the ego anything. Split mind doesn't need to be split mind. Instead of split mind, oneness is seen. Mental chaos can't teach the ego anything. Mental chaos doesn't need to be mental chaos. Instead of mental chaos, oneness is seen. Very great. So, it's that easy. It's just that easy. It's nothing magical. It is simply we're reminding ourselves of what is already true. We're not establishing truth. We don't have to establish truth. Not at all. Truth is already true. We're just reminding ourselves, hey, truth is true. And all these attempts to teach something that isn't true is futile. Is futile. We can't teach what is not true. Cannot, because what can learn it? And what meaning could learning it possibly have? None whatsoever. So, all of this mental states, these negative mental states, split mind, dementia, Alzheimer's, schizophrenia, psychosis, neurosis, confusion, depression, despair, schizophrenia, you name it, paranoia, all these things. Those are all attempts to teach the ego something. Cannot teach the ego anything. Cannot teach the ego anything. Totally impossible. So we're just reminding ourselves that we don't need, all this stuff isn't necessary to be what we're making it into. Schizophrenia doesn't need to be schizophrenia. We don't need to hold on to it. Instead, we let it go. Oneness is seen. Oneness is seen. And that cures the continuity problem that we have. All right. Very great. Great work. We'll see you in the next video.